We are a people that follow after those things that make for peace, love, and unity.
David Johnson is an Australian friend who traveled in the ministry in the United States in the summer of 2024. He is a member of Queensland Regional Meeting and an affiliate of Marlborough Monthly Meeting. His travels were cleared and supported by both meetings, so the traditional report provided at the end of a ministry were presented in a joint Zoom gathering. His report was recorded, and we provide it here for those who may have an interest.
It's our custom in Australia here to begin any gathering by acknowledging the traditional owners, the Indigenous owners of the land where we meet. So as we gather today, let us acknowledge the traditional owners of the land where we meet. In Brisbane's case, the Jagera and Turrbal people, and for the various nations where the individuals here reside. These people have cared for this land and held ceremony on it for untold thousands of years, and they call on us to care for it with them. Let us also offer our respect to the elders of these nations, past and present, and give thanks for the wisdom which they share with us. I also offer greetings to all Indigenous people present, and I look forward to working with you to see God's justice over this land.
Hello, friends with whom I have worshipped and travelled in many places. I'm grateful for this opportunity to share a little about the travels that Trish and I did amongst you in 7th and 8th months. And I'll just screen share a little presentation so I can keep track of things a bit for myself. When I do this, it occupies my screen, so I can't see you. I thought what we might do is I'll run through just some of the principal highlights of my time, and then hopefully allow some time at the end of the, say after about 35 minutes for any questions. Now, let me just see what I have to do here. Share the screen. And I'm just going to push this button. It'll go black for a minute, but hopefully there'll be some images come on in a moment or two. I am very grateful for the clearness and the preparation for the travelling, which was given to me by both Queensland Regional Meeting and Marlborough Monthly Meeting friends. And just for the numerous opportunities I had amongst you all, I wanted to make a little summary to start with, which is that I kept track of it just for interest. We travelled over 40,000 kilometres by air and 3,800 kilometres by road and rail. It seems to me, I spoke in front of about 516 people. The trip was disrupted by COVID infections, firstly for me and then for Tricia, for about 10 days. But the great blessing was I was able to attend 32 meetings for worship, not 32 different ones. Sometimes they were the same meeting, on 3 days in a row. But that's a wonderful blessing for me who lives in an isolated place. I delivered 9 study circles. There were 2, unfortunately, cancelled by the COVID infections. Numerous opportunities for worshipful conversations. So I benefited from the planning and support and accompaniment of many people, several of whom are with us on this screen share this morning. Tricia accompanied me as an elder, but also as an overseer, doing a lot of the travel trip planning. And local elders and ministers also held the spiritual work, especially when Trish took some time off to be at Pendle Hill. After a period of time in California, recovering from the time change, the first major place we went to was North Carolina, yearly meeting conservative. Now, about 80 people present at this, and there are about 434 members in the yearly meeting. It's just lovely to be with a group of friends where we have worship every morning. I want to draw attention to a couple of things that really struck both Tricia and I. The first one of them is, as is the practice in the conservative meetings, but not the practice in the liberal meetings that I've been to, there was diligent attention in each of the meetings beforehand to answering the queries for the monthly meetings. There are queries for both monthly meetings and for individuals. Now, at the yearly meeting in North Carolina in Greensboro, there was very careful attention, as happened also in Ohio yearly meeting, a careful listening by the whole yearly meeting present, with a concern to hearing what each of the monthly meetings had answered the queries. And this is in the spirit of, in a sense, allowing each of our meetings and each of the individuals to be tested by the Spirit and the light as to what they're doing with respect to those queries. But there's also the other half of it. What is the yearly meeting doing to ensure the life of those meetings within its care? And as we sat there in North Carolina, a member of each of the monthly meetings was sitting on a chair, a row of them, and each of them read out the answer. And it was a very authentic answering, because one could feel how each yearly meeting was wrestling, and in some cases could answer what they were making progress with, but also answering what they were having difficulty with. No meeting can perhaps answer all of the calls that the Quaker membership feels. So each monthly meeting has to discern what are we being called to amongst all the things that need doing. And that was being answered in front of the whole yearly meeting. Like most yearly meetings, some business items were readily accepted and some required considerable wrestling. I was fortunate to have the opportunity to offer a study session on the light in the conscience, about 30 people present, some online, some on Zoom, and to be upheld by Tricia and a couple of other people from American friends. The other point I want to mention is at the end of the yearly meeting in the last session, when all the epistles have been read and approved, a visitor is asked, and Trish was the one this time, to read the individual queries. And this is in the manner of preparing all for going forth from the gathered yearly meeting. And I found it a powerful example of spiritual attentiveness as you go forth to seek first the kingdom of God and righteousness, and then all else will be added unto you. And there was a sense of going forth with both being encouraged and in fact drawn to consider, where am I in each of these individual queries before I go forth to my work and being in the world. I'll read one of the meeting queries out. How does the meeting provide for the continuing spiritual growth and transformation of its members and attenders, both children and adults? This, of course, is North Carolina Conservative Yearly Meeting. What ongoing programs or events does the meeting offer or facilitate to help individuals grow in their faith at every stage of life, becoming more firmly grounded in the Quaker faith tradition? Does the meeting strive to make members and attenders aware of growth and study opportunities elsewhere? And does it help individuals overcome financial or other obstacles that might otherwise prevent their participation? Every meeting that I've had anything to do with does this to some extent. But it's a powerful statement in a way that the yearly meeting and each meeting, this is one of their responsibilities. While we're in Greensborough, two things. Trish and I visited the International Civil Rights Centre in Greensborough. Now, this is the old Woolworths store where on the 1st of February 1960, 4 black students made the first lunch counter sit-in of the civil rights movement. And this spread and had a powerful effect. So this centre is actually in the same Woolworths store. And you can go and you can see the same lunch counter they sat in, the same decorations, the same plates, the same teacups and so on. And we're taken through there by a young African-American man. And there's also a lot of other exhibits about the civil rights campaign. These 4 young men, it's enormous courage, enormous spiritual courage. I mean, 1960 is only a couple of years, maybe is it 4 or 5 years after the horrendous death of Emmett Till. These 4 people could have disappeared too. They knew that, but they actually survived. Enormous courage, non-violent sit-in. I also had the opportunity to visit the Guildford College Quaker Library and Archive and see how they store things, how they handle things, how they shelve things, which was good instruction for me. As many of you know, that we're planning to have a significant Quaker library at Silver Wattle Quaker Centre in Australia. One other thing in this area, going up, particularly through North Carolina and into Virginia, I'd heard of the Shenandoah Valley, but I didn't appreciate some of what happened there. It was a breadbasket, still is a breadbasket, beautiful fields of grain, and it was a battleground area in the Civil War between 1861 and 1865. As part of that war, there was a 14-day period which is called the Burning. And I learned about this from a wonderful little museum in Rockton, which 2 folks here know very well. And the idea was to starve out the Confederate forces and to break their will. And it's just a horrendous example which affected me very deeply, because I look back through history, how often this technique has been used, this strategy, and the destruction of property and of people. I sometimes think, and I felt overwhelmed about the arrogance and the vengefulness and the cruelty of the human race. Look at the quote at the bottom. General Sheridan boasts in his report to General Grant, "I have destroyed over 2,000 barns filled with wheat, hay and farming implements, over 70 grain mills filled with flour and wheat, driving in front of the army over 4,000 head of stock, and have killed and issued to the troops not less than 3,000 sheep, and they killed all the pigs on site too. I mean, it took decades for these people to recover. Now, many of these were actually pacifist Mennonite farms. They weren't actually protagonists in the war. And this violence and fear, my dear friends, is still evident in the American system. It's actually has a lot of fear in it, America. In Harrisonburg, where we were well looked after by friends from Rockingham meeting, we met for worship at Hopkins Gap, visited the Rockton Historical Museum, where I also gave a public talk, 14 people present, many of whom were not Quaker attenders or members. Visited the Bridgewater College, which is the College of the Brethren, and their rare book library. Attended some lovely singing of traditional Mennonite and other songs, the Sacred Harp tradition. Drove past a Native American massacre site, and unfortunately the visits to Charlottesville and Adelphi were cancelled due to the COVID. We moved on to Pennsylvania, taking a weekend here, and were able to attend Keystone Fellowship meeting at Bird in Hand, built in 1749. I've been able to worship with these friends before at a potluck lunch, and we shared worshipfully on some of the writings of an early Quaker, Joan Vokins, and I'll put one of them up in a minute. Visited an extraordinary place called the Tabernacle, which has a life-size model of the Hebrew temple, all in Amish country. So here's the quote from Joan Vokins. What I'll do is just include a couple of quotes here and there, which were sort of like some of the spiritual themes that were through my travels. Joan Vokins, who was born probably around 1630 and died in 1690, travelled in the US in 1680, I think it was, and was also travelling in Ireland in the ministry. And she was at the annual meeting in London in 1690 and died at Reading on her way home on the 22nd of July. Unfortunately, her husband was not with her, and I think her son, because he and the son, both of them, were in jail for not paying their tithes. It's a different sort of parting than one might hope for. Here's Joan talking. And also, what happiness might be received by taking heed to the light that shined in my heart. She came to friends after she was married and was immediately changed. She remembered the light that shined in my heart. And what happiness by noticing what it was asking of me. Which makes manifest that the way to the crown of glory is through the daily cross to my own will, and to take Christ's yoke upon that nature that would not be subject, that yoke which is easy and leads to rest. And how precious was the heart-searching light when we first knew it to shine upon our tabernacles, that's our inward temples, to guide us in the narrow way wherein is life and perfect peace for those whose minds are stayed on the Lord. I think one can sense the unwavering attentiveness and dependence which these early friends had upon the light of Christ shining within them and showing them the narrow path to be followed. And the next day, joy for me, because this is the meeting with which I'm affiliated and for which I have much love also. Marlborough Meeting House, 1801. worshipped outside under the trees. We had to have some social separation because it was not clear I was not clear of COVID. Potluck lunch and study circle on the light in the conscience. And the quote, which was sort of staying with us and part of the advertisement for encouraging people to attend, was from the young Quaker, John Banks, which speaks of God's love to show us the way. God in his love, according to his divine wisdom, hath given thee a measure of his good spirit, grace and light, which he hath placed in thy heart and conscience. This is a primary preaching of the first and second generation friends. That the light is not a huge Damascus experience. It is with us every moment. If we notice it in our heart and conscience saying, do this, don't do that, be cautious about that. Whether it's both, whether it's sound, whether it's deeds or words that identifies the weeds, deeds or words where we haven't actually been clear before God, or whether that's thoughts that are rising in us and the light in our heart and conscience says, that's not a helpful thought. No, dismiss that one. We also went, had a little stay in Kennett Square and went to Longwood Gardens. We all see Tricia just loves the plants and the flowers. This was Lenape land. In 1700, a Quaker farmer, George Pierce, purchased the 402 acres from William Penn's commissioners. Later, two grandsons began a 15-acre arboretum. When later descendants lost interest, it fell into disrepair a bit. But it was acquired in 1906 by Pierre Dupont, a French chemist and engineer. And they earned their first wealth making gunpowder and then diversified into chemicals and later plastics, worth squillions. Pierre Dupont was an industrialist, a very capable engineer, conservationist, farmer, designer, impresario and philanthropist. And so now this property at Longwood has 200 acres of the most beautiful flower gardens and trees. It's also famous because at this place, within 10 miles in those days in the 1800s, there were 10 Quaker meeting houses within 10 miles. And a group of friends who were very, very concerned about the slavery situation, while many of their meetings were concerned, they wanted to maintain the prayerful worship, but not get too much into the activism, apart from what they did in their own lives. So people like Lucretia Mott and others split away from Pennsylvania Yearly Meeting to form the the Pennsylvania Yearly Meeting of Progressive Friends in 1853. And they drew also friends from Marlborough Meeting and others in this area. And this became one of the focal points of the anti-slavery movement. That building is still in Longwood Gardens. Was there in this time here too, I guess, as a person who's spent a lot of time in activism against the arms trade and war, we attended, Tricia and I, a very small group at Kennett Friends meeting on a Thursday evening, a meeting for worship, peace and hope. And about this time I was made aware of this extraordinary individual, Smedley Butler, who you just run across these people. He was a child of a Quaker in Western Pennsylvania and then joined the US Marines and rose to be a very senior person, much decorated. And then he became a sort of ambassador, in quotes, for the US, who made sure that things happened the way US wanted it to be. As he says, during that period, I spent most of my time as a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and for the bankers. I was a racketeer for capitalism. I suspected I was just part of that racket all the time. Now I'm sure of it. And I'd never heard of this little book, which has come to my attention, War is a Racket by Smedley Butler. So a racket is just a thing where a limited number of individuals actually know what's going on and get most of the financial benefit, and everybody else isn't quite aware of it. At Pendle Hill, we spent time. Tricia had an extended period there herself. I met with the Pendle Hill staff because of the proposed development of an Australian Quaker writing ministry out of Silver Wattle. We were able to go to the daily meeting for worship, of which there's a considerable number every day. And we were delivered there by our friend Bridget Castelline from Kennett Square. And I was moved to observe in a place like Pendle Hill, which has been going since 1930, like many meetings in which we are surrounded by the cloud of witnesses, as it's called in Hebrews 12, of all the people who have worshipped and worked and maintained the life of an institution or of a meeting. And here we are sitting surrounded by them. And I mentioned one person, Vincent Harding, who was a speechwriter for Martin Luther King that I knew of. And I knew he'd spent time at Pendle Hill. And Bridget was moved to observe. I remember Vincent Harding. I was his typist. So it was a lovely connection. And when Vincent died, there was a tree planted in 2014 when he died, in memory of him, civil rights mentor and speechwriter for Martin Luther King. And here's our friend Bridget standing under the tree, the dove tree at Pendle Hill, which we went looking for, and eventually Tricia actually found it first off, and we went and just remembered some of these people who've done such extraordinarily strong spiritual and practical work. While Tricia was at Pendle Hill, I was able to travel to a high yearly meeting, conservative, in Barnesville, Ohio. This is a very rich experience, held in the presence continuum. The early morning prayers on the porch, which you can see on the end of this building on the upper right-hand corner. This is Stillwater Meeting House at Barnesville. Seats 1,200 people when it was built. And that's what it was built for. These were in the days when a lot of the Quaker community was involved in agriculture and farming work. So there were lots and lots of them. And it's the mechanisation of farming which has really stripped these people away from those sort of livelihoods and ways of being. I'll give you one example. I picked up some old minutes from this meeting house that were spare when there were both minutes for men's meeting and women's meeting. And in the school committee in 1917 for the minutes, the schools committee records we had 469 children in schools. Now that's bigger than most yearly meetings. You just realise the enormous changes. Meeting for Bible reading, meeting for worship, meeting for business, many fellowships and opportunities. And I was offered the opportunity to spend some time one evening with friends exploring early Quaker writings on the topic of regeneration. Very important term in early Christian spirituality and in early Quaker spirituality. The regeneration is the rebirthing of ourselves, the leaving behind of the old self and the growth of the true self as the seed of Christ grows within us. Something we cannot of ourselves do. We just have to accept it as it starts to develop within us and not rebut it or block it. A little quote from the yearly meeting minutes. We learned about regeneration through the words of the first friends. This teaching was not a series of explanations. It was a lesson taught with poetry. These friends described regeneration with experiential language, but they were more than just descriptions of experiences. I was often able to make the point that early Christian writings in the Gospels and the Epistles and the first friends' writings are not dogmas or essential doctrines. They are actually written experiences, which we can enter into as we open ourselves to the Spirit of God working within us right now. It was as though we too were having the experience as it was read to us. As Thomas Colley put it, they used that sacred language proclaimed in the soul, not the outward words. It was such a blessing, friends, to be able to do this. It's a picture of the inside of the meeting house there too, with the main benches and the facing benches to the left. It was such a blessing, really, to sit in a place like that, which had been prayed in for so many years, and be able to feel the strength of that prayer and spirituality still with us. Just a wonderful little time. Last afternoon after yearly meeting, before we all started to disperse, we went to Chestnut Ridge meeting. It's a common place for friends at Barnesville after the yearly meeting to worship before they go their own ways. Built in 1890, little cottage type, little wooden meeting house in the woods. And as far as we know, the last Quaker meeting where men and women enter through different doors. And we'll see two friends who are with us today. One female going on the left and the male going in on the right. But when you get inside, there's no sense of separation. This is in the same intimate, solid space of worship in the presence of God. Wonderful blessing. I draw attention to one other meeting that I was able to attend. It was in Salem Quarterly in Ohio, more north in Ohio. It was a public event, mainly Quakers there, but quite a range of other folks as well. It was advertised as Quaker Spirituality, Learn What We Are Conserving, in the sense that conservative friends are conserving the early practices and spirituality of the Quakers, not necessarily conservative socialists. So I put 3 quotes up here, which I used on that evening. The pivotal one for friends, of course, the true light which lighteth or enlighteneth every man that cometh into the world, from John, first chapter of John's Gospel. Jesus' assertion later on, I am the light of the world. He that followeth me shall not walk in darkness, but shall have the light of life. I remember reading that years ago myself and thinking, well, if that's the case, why not try it? Interesting, you see, Jesus is not saying you have to go to church, or you have to go to meet worship, or you have to do this, or you have to know that, or anything like that. The instruction is actually quite simple. Just follow me, and you will find the light will grow in you, and you will not stumble, but you'll have the light and life and power come to grow in you. And the line from the Ephesians, Paul's talking about, if we ever feel inwardly reproved for something we've done in our conscience, but all things that are reproved are made manifest, that's shown, we become aware of them by the light. For whatsoever doth make manifest is light. And it's very different to people saying, oh, I suddenly realised, I began to understand, or actually that's centred on our own power and ability. Whereas the early Quakers and early Christians said, what's showing me what's right and wrong and making me aware, what's revealing stuff to me? It's not my own power or my own brain power. It's actually the light doing it to me. Whatsoever doth make manifest is light. Lovely meeting and together. Returned to California and spent some time, and I'll mention just a couple of places. One is, this is a different sort of meeting house, huh? This is San Francisco meeting town, downtown. And was also the place where the American Friends Service Committee was quartered for a while. And their meeting, they're quite clear about our responsibilities as individuals. Meeting for worship starts 11 a.m. and at that point they lock the door. And they don't open it for 15 minutes, so you have to be there on time. So Trish and I got in there and we looked at this huge number of people at 11 o'clock and we thought, wow, this is pretty good. Then we realised that there was a reason that everybody was there on time. Wonderful meeting. 4 young friends at the age of 16 years were actually brought up the front and given a gift with a framed Quaker quote in the Book of Spiritual Writings and actually told, we love you. We want you to be part of this meeting. You're valuable to us. 34 people stayed for a second hour. They have a program of second hour study. I did on the light of the conscience. This is an example of a meeting where they've decided what their principle, that each of them does bits of piecework or other human rights work or visiting people in hospital, whatever. But their meeting commitment is to feeding the homeless, of which there are abundant numbers in this area of San Francisco. That's the discernment they've made, sort of like answering that question, one of the queries from North Carolina. We visited Portland in Oregon and visited 3 meetings there. There was an opportunity to do a 5-hour retreat on spiritual condition in one of the meetings there, with a meal in the middle of it, 2 sessions with a meal. The first one on our individual spiritual condition and the second one on the condition of the meeting. So the question people were sent away with and invited to reflect upon before supper was, might we reflect on our own condition? What is blocking me and what needs to change? And that proved a fruitful exercise for many people, not to discuss it, but actually to go away and write the answers in your own space without talking to anybody. We also attended West Hills Friends Church and I was given a message. The picture here, for those of us in Australia, it's Tricia and I obviously took the picture with Holly Dines and Alan Dines in a little cafe in Portland. Holly Dines does work for Australia Yearly Meeting in terms of our web work and communications. And then there was also a meeting at Multnomah Friends meeting to do a Light in the Conscience study with about 20 people as part of their adult education program. There were a couple of people who left after about a third of the time. It wasn't for them, but everybody else stayed, and we had a very rich time together. The last meeting was on the morning before we flew out from San Francisco to come home at Sacramento. Jesus is both an earthly and a heavenly man whose spirit is still mysteriously with us, as mentioned. The sign on there in blue there, you can't read these, is love thy neighbour, no exceptions. And about this time, I think it might actually have been just before we left from Portland to go to Sacramento, a piece of scripture came to us from Isaiah. So shall my word be that goeth forth out of my mouth. It shall not return unto me void, but it shall accomplish that which I please, and it shall prosper in the thing whereto I sent it. And I have to say, friends, I felt that working through me. And certainly it was sent to me, and it certainly affected me. It certainly changed me. A couple of slides, my learnings. It became clear to me traveling around there is spiritual hunger evident everywhere I went, with much anxiety and fear for the world on several fronts. My sense is overall there is a meagre understanding of Quaker heritage, spirituality and practice. I've mentioned before that answering the queries for the community, for meetings and for individuals is a very valuable practice, which we don't do in Australia, and I don't know of any other Liberal meetings that do it. I found that the light in the conscience is a readily acceptable concept and speaks to modern experience of many people. It's just a matter of explaining to folks that this is not the voice of your parents or your teachers in your head. This is actually God showing you the way. I learned to beware of any hard edges in my heart or any uppityness. Anytime I felt some hardness of judgment starting to ossify the edge of my heart, I knew it was time to, I learned it was time to actually sit still and ask for the softening to happen. And I learned very deeply that the false self has to be denied. The false self arises in us so often. It's encultured into us, and to trust the voice completely. The false self is easily identified because it's an inward commentary that relies on what I have, what I do, or what people think of me. Any thoughts associated with that are not from the Lord. It's time to turn aside. I suppose the overall thing that I learned was, what am I and what are we called to be? Are each of us and our meetings to be a spiritual oasis or to be involved in active witness? And when I look back, the first generation friends were actually both. And God can call us into each of those or to both of them. Well, it's important to be attentive to know which or both each of us and each of our meetings has been called into. Because the first generation friends were both. They were spiritually completely surrendered to the inward Christ, the Spirit of God in them, deeply wary of the allures of the world, and in consequence felt the life and power rising in them. And they were also powerfully active public witnesses against the corruptions in individuals and in the society around them. The corruptions of swearing and tithing, inequalities and violence, with an amazing courage and energy. So I came away, really, which has happened to me before in my life, at this stage, what am I to be? And what are we to be? So friends, it always takes me a little longer sometimes to say it all, but I'm happy to sit quietly, and I'm also happy, if there are any questions, to do my best to answer them.
Perhaps you felt like your COVID days were wasted, but I didn't feel like that at all. I had the full benefit of you and Trish for that whole time.
Yeah, bonus time.
So glad for thy time with us, a yearly meeting in Ohio. Having a long enough time to connect with a lot of the people there was a blessing for all of us.
We only have a few minutes left, and I want to spend some of them in worship, but I want to acknowledge that nobody was more changed than me, to my knowledge, by this 2 months traveling in the ministry.
And it's not done either. It'll continue to bear fruit as he goes forward.
We are a people that follow after those things that make for peace, love, and unity. It is our desire that others' feet may walk in the same. We do deny and bear our testimony against all strife and wars and contention.